Welcome to Separate Together, a podcast exploring what happens when we change not just how families separate, but how we think about legal separations altogether. Hosted by me, practicing family lawyer Melissa Bourgeois.
And by me, definitely not a lawyer, Cody Deb.
And just a quick disclaimer, we like to remind our listeners that this podcast should not be taken as legal advice and it is for informational purposes only. Because everyone's relationship is different, please consult a legal professional if you have any questions.
Hello.
Hi.
You are somewhere different right now.
I am somewhere different right now.
Where are you?
Do you want to see where I am?
Yes, I do. Yeah, show me.
So this is my view right now, and I happen to be in what I consider to be one of the most beautiful cities in the world, and that is Montreal.
It's not Edmonton?
Hey, Edmonton does have its own set of beauty. But yes, Montreal, a beautiful city that I always refer to as Ville de mon cœur, which means like the center of my heart. It's a city that I lived in for 5.5 years, actually, during part of my educational experience. Yeah, and then I just managed to take the beautiful Via Rail. So your dad, I think I'll have lots of stories to share with him, but I took the train here yesterday from Ottawa, which is another beautiful city, and another one where I spent a significant amount of time for my educational journey as well. So I'm out east, and you're out west, and
yes.
I hear it's really hot.
It is very hot today. Yep, the garbage cans are all smelling. It feels very New York City in little old Edmonton, but that's okay. Mm-hmm. We'll take it, right? No complaining. Yeah. No complaining, which is hard for me.
No.
So you did your sociology master's in Montreal, but you did law school in Ottawa, correct?
Yes. Yeah.
Good.
So I started my undergraduate at the U of A, and then I transferred here to Montreal halfway through because I was in my early 20s, and this city, when you are in your early 20s, is so alive and vivid. It is. I was walking last night, just kind of watching all of the experience of these 20-year-olds right now that they get to have. And then transferred to Ottawa, well, not transferred, but applied to Ottawa for law school, and then moved over there.
And I mean, I apologize. I am going to absolutely hammer you with questions about law school because unfortunately my only kind of understanding of it is Legally Blonde. So I just picture you in the outfit with the MacBook, the proto MacBook in a vibrant color, if I know you, just sitting there and being like, excuse me, I have a question. But perhaps it wasn't like that. Maybe you can tell me what it was actually like.
I don't think I was nearly as cute, and I think it was, I don't think it was one of those things. So, I mean, it was, for any people out there who are contemplating law school or who are applying to law school or maybe who have even applied and have now been accepted, as I was reflecting when I was in Ottawa, now I'm grown-up version of me, but there was so much of that time that, you're learning so much, your mind is expanding because you're actually learning how to think in an entirely different way than most of the way that we kind of go through the world. But also, it's a huge pressure cooker. Like, it's just, it's major. So it was kind of neat to revisit it as a grown-up. I was there at a grown-up conference and just, kind of speaking about our process here and what we were doing, to assist Canadians. But, to be there, not with that kind of like, when's my next test or when's my, where am I going after this or all of these kinds of questions was really actually kind of neat. So went to my old faculty, got to take a little tour around, see what it was like, revisit those halls of anxiety,
a little memory lane,
sweat.
Yeah, I was gonna say, did you immediately full panic attack?
Yeah, there was a moment where I was like, whoo, because there's a section where the stairs kind of go down, and it's been renovated since, but back in the day it was just this dark, almost tunnel kind of thing, and it was like this tunnel of doom that you were going to your, windowless classrooms to learn, and particularly for me, because half of my education was en français, so there was just this additional layer of like, okay, and I survived, and here I am.
Yeah, I mean, I can relate to that. I obviously, when I went to the U of A as well, and I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. I took a liberal arts degree. So all of my buildings were incredibly old, no air conditioning, barely working lights, but I parked by the brand new computer sciences engineering. So I would walk through and be like, oh, I'm not making the right choice. This money is being wasted. But thankfully my parents they did not mind.
Supported you.
Yes. So I have a question for you. I'm very happy to play the idiot. It's a very comfortable role for me. How long is law school? Is it like a master's? Is it 2 years? Is it 4 years?
It is normally 3 years, but that is after, for most of the country anyway, after you've completed an undergraduate degree. So you're not normally admitted to law school unless you are incredibly exceptional, I think, or in Quebec, which we can talk about. You don't need a university degree to apply to law school in Quebec. So it's usually your undergraduate and then another 3 years. My program, however, was 4. So what I did was the National Program of Law at U of Ottawa, and that one is a bilingual program where you obtain 2 law degrees, so a common law degree and a civil law degree. So that took me 4 years to complete.
But that's only in Ottawa. And what does that mean?
Yes, and McGill, I believe, offers it as well. Quebec is actually a really, really different province in Canada. I think a lot of
So I've heard.
I mean, first, it's predominantly French, so that makes its difference. I'll try to break this down, but a lot of law in Canada is either overseen by the federal government, so our national government, or there's also provincial governments that have authority to make and create law. So there's kind of this hybrid where provinces, let's say Alberta, governs how people divide property, but the spousal support advisory guidelines or child support is set up by a federal act, which is the Divorce Act. So that's why Quebec happens to be very different, because what they are able to govern provincially, their laws are based actually in the civil law system and not the common law system. And the civil law system is actually, instead of being, we have the common law that comes down from England and Wales and all of that, this comes down from France. And so we actually have a civil code. It's a Bible that kind of sets out how certain forms of law, like, this is how contracts work. This is the outcome. If this happens, this is the outcome, those types of things. So it's very, very different. It was taken from the Napoleonic Code. And so it, even the leaf, it reminded me always of a Bible because it has those very thin pages and it's canonized. So civil law here in Quebec is governed by that. So in order to practice law in Quebec, you need to have a civil law degree. And because I had been living in Montreal for 5.5 years, again, I love this city. I think it's the best city to live in. I was planning to return back here after my studies. So I wanted to have that civil law degree. But I think my spidey senses or my intuition might have told me a little bit of things, which is as you age, circumstances change, and you might not want to close the door on common law, which is, probably what is practiced in all of the other provinces, the US, everywhere else. So that's why I pursued that degree.
Okay, so an extra year. And is it literally just double the work?
I was wholly unprepared.
It's a lot to hold the door open.
Yeah, I mean, first year law school, it's much like high school. Everything is basically you must take these classes, right? Mm-hmm. So we had very few elective, if at all. I can't remember, but it wasn't. It was 5 classes, which was, administrative law. Let's say we're going to learn about constitutional law. Probably contracts was a major one. We had 3 classes in contracts. Criminal law also. So really the major ones were essential. And then, by the second year though, we were able to start taking electives. And that's what I was really reflecting on as I was walking the streets of Ottawa. And, the conference that I was at, we started the first evening at the Supreme Court of Canada, which was a remarkable experience, I realized, for myself as a law student to have access to these big courts. So Ottawa is our national capital, therefore the government is based there. And so because of that, we have federal court there, we have the federal taxation court is there, and the Supreme Court. So oftentimes we would actually sit in and, learn from these incredible justices. But also the remaining part of the conference was at the National Archives and Libraries. But as I was walking, the National Bank of Canada was there, and I was like, how neat is it that I really, this was my normal for 4 years. This was my inspiration. And so it really got me to reflect on my particular education and how the faculty in Ottawa is really based in a lot of public kind of law, public policy. So I ended up taking a lot of electives like international environmental law, international human rights law, or Indigenous study law, those types of things. So really kind of broad thinking. And it was then that I was like, oh yeah, that's probably why why this major project that we undertake at One Family Law has made sense, because I had the exposure during my legal studies of like, okay, this is the branches of government, how they intersect with the branches of the judges, how the judges in the government make the law, and then how the people basically are governed accordingly. So yeah, so it was a really, really neat experience, but hugely overwhelming.
Obviously, you came to your law degree via sociology. Typically, how do people get to law school? Like, is it through an MBA or I guess
business degree?
Yeah. How do they come to it?
Yeah, so there's two elements. It really does matter, like what you did in your undergraduate, because an application for law school is not just like I plug in some things online and then you accept me. It's actually, here is my application, which is my request, but you write a letter. So here's the reasons why I want to pursue law school. And then we also have the LSATs, which is a preparatory kind of examination. So based on your scores is, the admittance, and then what your grades were in your undergraduate. So I would say, yes, a lot of my colleagues had been in business school before. There's a lot of art students to science, right? Because, patent lawyers, people who, kind of specialize more in those areas would have those backgrounds. But, I wouldn't say there was one particular, you must do an undergraduate, but the scales, from what I understand, are based on the complexity of your undergraduate as well, because no offense to you and I, but an arts degree at some points is maybe not as seen as complex as having a statistics degree or something like that, right? So that is all the measurements of scale, and that is also the overwhelming part is as you're applying to law schools, they all have close to the same deadlines for applying. You have to apply, I can't remember what it was, but let's just say 6 months before you would hear anything. And then the rollout starts with one school, like some of them would admit you before other ones, and you would have deadlines that you would kind of have to decide whether you committed to that school or you were waiting for I didn't apply to U of T or any of those kind of top tier, McGill's, all of that, where it's just like, okay, hugely competitive. That's kind of the starting point where you're just all of a sudden, it was like, you go from the general arts degree where you're just kind of another anonymous person and you might have some thoughts and really great comments, but then you get shuffled in because all of us who are in law school are A-type kind of personalities, and then we're like shoved all into this ecosystem where all of a sudden you're like, hi, okay, like everyone here is high achieving and I'm not here to just think about concept, like I'm here to get to an end goal, right? Mm-hmm. So it was really, really that. And for me, the first year was hugely challenging because I didn't come from a family that had much educational kind of pursuits. For my family hadn't been. So a lot of these things that my colleagues had learned, maybe because their parents were lawyers or the private schools they had been to, I didn't have that. So I was learning a lot of things that I was just like, oh, I didn't even know that existed, or these terminology. So for me, that was a lot more acute, just having to learn really quickly, I think, comparatively. Not saying that it's challenging no matter who we were, but there were just certain concepts that I was like, I've never heard of a tort. Like, right?
Even I've heard of a tort now.
Yeah. But have you learned about it en français? Don't ask me what it is. Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can see. I mean, that seems like one instance where the kind of hidden privileges of like maybe having family who worked in that area or who had been before would be incredibly useful. But you find yourself now in this situation with a bunch of people who are like-minded. Once you have that kind of foundational knowledge, like you said, you do kind of your first year of like, this is what the law is, this is how we're learning. When you do start to kind of delineate into like, I would like to work maybe in environmental law or indigenous law or contracts or whatever, like when does that start happening?
Yeah, usually around the second year, and that's when you kind of start, as I said, to take your electives. And what was neat about that is then the formation, because I call us kind of like little co-soldiers. I'm visiting an old friend from law school while I'm here. We really like banded together in this, like, we've got to like survival, like we got to band together, right? So study groups, all of those types of things. But what was nice is that by the second year, you got to choose electives, so you met more like-minded people. It was less kind of, so there was one of my friends who ended up in 4 out of my 5 electives. And so we obviously clearly had social justice kind of tendencies, those types of things. But I was sharing with someone at the conference that by the time I was getting closer to the end of my studies, I really loved these big kind of public law areas of practice, and particularly environmental law. It was really kind of, I was like, this is, I think this is kind of important for the world. But I came to an end point where I was just like, oh, okay, if I want to practice as an environmental lawyer, I either will become one of those practitioners that ties herself to a tree, like an activist, or I would probably have to work for big oil, which really fundamentally wasn't, but there wasn't really an opportunity in the middle to be like, oh, well, what would a practicing environmental lawyer actually do, right? And so those were kind of more challenging, because the obvious streams for those of us post-law school is corporate law. That is, I think, what guides a lot of people in their application is corporate law. And you have to apply for an articling position. So what articling means is you do normally a year of training underneath another lawyer to obtain your license, which is very challenging for those who can't get those. You have to have that in order to be able to practice. But they would start recruiting us, for summer positions the year before, and then the year before your articles, they would be recruiting you as well. So we would have these schmaltzy kind of like fancy wine and cheese things put on by these huge corporate law firms who were essentially trying to sell you as to why you should be applying there. And, and I already kind of had a sense that that wasn't the path for me, but I also was just like, well, maybe this is it was the most obvious and the only seemingly like non-challenge, like, you apply to this law firm, you're going to be practicing corporate law, and you will, 5 years in, 10 years in, this is where the career will go. But there wasn't a lot of resources, I think, little family law outfits or a little environmental law boutique firm or those types of things who could probably travel to Ottawa, put on something like this and explain where maybe non-traditional kind of ways of going could be, right? So so anyway, it just it was an interesting time, I think, like in terms of that's what I was kind of thinking about in Ottawa, like now that I know where my path it has led, and very grateful for that. But there were so many months of wandering these streets being like, where am I going, what am I doing? And and then I laughed and I was like, I have to tell Cody this. I forgot that somehow I applied and received an interview at the Taxation Court of Canada. And I don't know how or why, I had an incredible tax prof who taught tax from a philosophical approach, and he is the taxation expert here in Canada, and he really took a liking to me. And then I just thought, like, a clerkship, it's kind of, it's one of those, it's a very honorable position to receive as a law student, to clerk for a judge. And somehow they interviewed me, and it was the most incredible thing, because you walk into their chambers and there are these big oak doors that, like, there's somebody else opens them, like almost palatial, and then you go in and it's like everything's purple at that tax court. You sit on these plush chairs with these like judges who were literally in their robes, just probably looking at me very quizzically, like, what are you lost?
Yes,
like,
I am lost. Yes.
It's like literally, I'm just trying to find myself. And, unsurprisingly, I wasn't chosen for this clerkship. But, that was just another weird experience that I'd forgotten about, because I was like, well, what am I going to do after this, right?
Yeah, I am, like, knowing what we know about society, and again, like, you can correct my very narrative mind, but like, I imagine in that environment, it's pretty Hollywood in the sense that, like, how quickly do you have your naive dreams absolutely brutalized? Like, these environmental lawyers, these family lawyers, these social justice warriors, not versus, but like along with these like corporate route, I want to be an insurance lawyer, like I've seen the movies, like I'm going to be a lobbyist for big tobacco. Exactly. Like, and I am going to make this salary. Like, how does that, as you're all learning together, as you're all forming these identities, like, how does that mesh? Like, do you hang out? Do you hate each other? Is it like grease lightning? Like what's happening?
Well, that's that's kind of what I was alluding to with like the shuffling of, you go from I'm the smartest of an array of like whatever to like now we're all high achieving, now we're all right, like, and we're all vying for the same, because those corporate articling positions were hugely fiercely competitive, because they pay a lot more for the starting of your career.
Do you get paid to article?
All of this, like, you should. I think we were talking about this at this conference. Unfortunately, there is an access to justice kind of problem with, particularly in Ontario, there are more graduates than there are spaces available to article, which, if you can understand that you cannot practice practice law unless you do complete your articling leads to a lot of vulnerable students who, certain firms will say, well, you can come in, but I'm not paying you. Or you can come in and maybe you're paying me, but I'll put my name. Yeah, so that's what she was saying in Ontario. Like, they're trying to kind of figure out how to regulate the articling positions a little bit more because these things are happening. Well, it's desperation, right?
Of course.
If you're like, morally and ethically, I have no issue putting my name on something and you can then finish out. But the challenge and the important thing, and that's what we were talking about this week as well, is that we are taught in law school how to think, but we are not taught how to practice yet. And it really, I was reflecting on the good fortune that I landed the articling position that I did because, there was at least some mentorship and some active teaching. But there are some students where it's just like you get there the first day, they give you your files and they're like, hey, get to court, figure this out. And you are really left to figuring this out only through your own painful experiences. Not that I didn't make those even with the mentorship that I had. But at the end of the day, the requirement in Alberta is supposed to be that you see at least 6 out of 8 practice groups, or at least it was when I got my bar call.
So it's kind of like a medical rotation?
Kind of.
You got to do peds, you got to do neuro.
And I don't know if in practice that is true, because I mean, a lot of the friends that I had were like, well, I'm going to be a wills and estates lawyer and I'm working here and they don't do anything else. But thankfully for me, the firm that I was at was fairly general. So I got exposure, I mean, first and foremost to family law, which I'll get to this, but was another common refrain, was the last thing that any law students ever wanted to touch. And I think unfortunately still is the reality. But my principal was practicing primarily in family law, and I'll get back to that one. But then from there, there was a corporate lawyer, so I got to learn corporate law a little bit from him. I got to learn how to practice real estate law. And then there was a civil injuries lawyer there, so personal injuries, where I got to sit in on these discoveries and all of these weird things. And then they sent me over to a criminal defense firm for a month, and that I still have such deep, profound respect for all criminal defense lawyers, and this work but oh my gosh, I don't think I slept for a month. It was like the hardest month that I ever, through my articles, had done. But what that did was give me exposure to a bunch of different options that maybe were not obvious, right? I don't know necessarily how many people's dreams are to become a personal injury lawyer, but once you're in it, you're like, my brain likes this. Like, I like to kind of evidentiary rules and different things. And then for me, the tie was these families. Like, all of a sudden I was like, oh, I'm a social creature, and I really like people in this way, and this seemed to be an opportunity to kind of maybe be able to help. But I would say for the last year of law school was constant anxiety as to where am I going to get an articling position, what am I going to do. At that time we were considering also where we were going to live in the country, so it was a challenge to say. So I passed my Law Society of Ontario bar exams because I was planning to article there, and those are 2 8-hour exams. So that is also nuts because you actually have to train your mind.
Did you do them back to back?
No, they're 2 separate days, but they're 8 hours, and you have binders that you're allowed to bring, obviously, but let's just say that the first day, I can't remember what it would be, but like criminal law, family, like whatever. And the challenge isn't like your knowledge, it's also, do you know how to find the answer in your notes? And so we would spend hours and hours in study groups just like tabbing and building ourselves roadmaps and mind maps.
So you built the binder?
Yeah.
Oh my God, do you still have it?
I don't know. I think my mom might actually somewhere. Like, it was nuts. Like, it was just, and then you have to train yourself like an actual marathon where you're like, I'm going to be sitting for 8 hours. And I think obviously there was probably a lunch break, but I got to time my snacks, my water consumption. I've got to time my brain. And also, and I remember after the first day, like I got home and my husband was like, how did it go? And I just like collapsed, like literally on the couch in like a spate of tears. Cause I was like, I don't even know. Like my brain was so just like,
well, and this would have been before your yoga career. So you weren't even doing vinyasas through.
No. Unfortunately for me, it was more scotch or something like that.
Fair enough.
So
that sounds
probably not that. Yeah. Right.
I do want to go back to something you said because I thought this was incredibly profound. You had said that they teach you how to think but not how to practice. This might be like, obviously I'm guessing wildly, but I imagine because the law is the law that like there is kind of a foundational element to from firm to firm to firm, or even practice to practice to practice, criminal to family to personal injury, that there is kind of the law. But then is it the case that each firm kind of has their own culture or like distinct way of executing the law or of understanding, interpreting. Like, is it that when you say they don't teach you how to practice, are you meaning that like the kind of implication is that you go out and you find a firm where you're like, I like this kind of jives with how I interpret the law. I'm going to stay here. I'm going to pursue this. Like, is that typically how a lawyer would approach working in their profession? Is like, okay, now I have this foundational understanding. I've decided on what field I want to specialize in, and now I'm going to go find a place for myself that aligns with how I want to practice in family law, how I want to interpret the law, my personal style. Like, is that what you're meaning?
I mean, yes, if you're fortunate enough, but I think oftentimes it's just like, where can I get in to get started, right?
So you don't have
firm culture. Agency. Firm culture is a big thing, right? So some of my colleagues would get 3 or 4 offerings from the major law firms, and then they would decide which one that they preferred in terms of their own, whatever the mission statement of that particular firm was. But what I mean by that is also there's the theoretical or the logic that we had to like learn how to think through that mind, which for me at first was really challenging because I had been like such a big systems thinker that to come back down to. But at the end of the day, like it really does come down to how to apply that in practice. And so, not often we weren't really given, unless you participated in moot court competitions or different things, rarely did we get practical kind of, this is how you bring a court application forward, or this is how you counsel a client, right? And that's why like the first couple of weeks, I was just like, like I remember Chris being like, you need to, file an affidavit. And I was like,
yes, I do.
Okay. Yes, that's great. Now I think, they have more access, but like there wasn't really like a chat GPT, like how do I do this, right? Procedurally. And then that is like, in family law, and why I'm grateful that my experience was as tough as it was, but learning to litigate first, then, I had to learn like, okay, like you have to apply for this, and then you have to give reasons as to why you're applying for this, and then you have to give evidence, and then you have to go and pitch it in court, and then you've got to set all of those pieces into play. That wasn't my experience in family law when I took it in school. It was more, okay, this is how the Divorce Act works. This is the child support guidelines. And so there was a lot of theoretical, but not quite so much practical. And that's, I think, the design of the articles is supposed to be that you follow a senior counsel around. And they were talking about the challenges of these days is that, in my case, my mentor was very generous with his time, and he tended not to charge his time to the clients when he was reviewing my work, but he would review it to ensure that there was integrity and that it was correct. But that's the challenge, unless you're in some of these firms that the articling, there's an actual staff probably that like onboards the students. There's 8 or 10 of them in the firm for that year. And so there's kind of that, smaller firms don't have that. So that's why it ends up being like, we're going to charge you the student rate. And of course people will hire the student, but the student doesn't have the same experience. So and that was also the huge challenge, because when you complete law school and you complete your articles, you then are practicing law. There's no distinguishing. I was like, can we just have a sticker that's like under 5-year bar call? Or like, because sometimes I'd be in my first year and then there would be a counsel who was 25 years into his practice. And so the level of experience or the diversity, would kind of, and I was strong enough because I was older coming into my law profession, but there would be a lot of kind of like diminishing or demeaning or bullying by certain older counsel because they would leverage your lack of experience as, and I was like, my lack of experience is not a lack of knowledge here. It's just I haven't been around as long as you have.
Yeah, and I mean, like, we've talked about this a number of times throughout this podcast, but like fundamentally, this is not an industry where it's in their best interest to educate you, help you along, and bring you up to speed. Like, you are working in opposition to their client's best interest. It is in their best interest then to diminish your intellect, to poke holes in your logic, and that is
and to knock you off your foundation.
Exactly, it's an incredibly challenging environment to try and gain experience, to try and build camaraderie and collegialness. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
There's that liberal arts degree.
Well, yeah.
Go ahead.
Like when I moved back to Edmonton and I started my articles, I was fortunate enough to meet a few of our now common friends who were already established in their careers and were going, and they were really kind in first bringing me into the legal fold, because for me the challenge was I hadn't gone to school in Alberta, so I didn't really have colleagues that I could rely on and be like, hey, do you feel like you're sinking every day too? Or like, is this nuts? Or, you know, like I didn't have that. And I remember Derek, one of the first times we went out for noodles, and he's like, it's gonna be like 5 years before you think you're at all competent. And he's like, and I was like, right, because we all think we're so like, I was like, let's just, and then I was like, oh, like 5, because you finally have had enough, like, oh, that didn't work, or that really worked, or this is my own, or okay, now I don't feel like I have to, like, you know, oftentimes when I was preparing for court at the beginning, it was like, you know, studying for an exam, and I would just overwork to just make sure that I'd covered everything off. But at a certain point you're like, okay, yeah, that's that kind of application, it's fine, it's not worth your while to be up all night trying to fix your submissions for the judge, right? That kind of thing. But yeah, it's that part that I was like, oh, okay. Right.
Yeah, and I think we had touched on this in a previous episode, but the reason that you ended up coming back to Alberta was because your partner, your husband at the time's family member was ill, right?
Yeah, and then my brother had his twins as well. And so when you're young, and that's when I was looking at watching all of these young people partying on the patio last night, and I was like, oh yeah, like you're young, you're carefree, and it's like Montreal's like the best, and you know, it's just this amazing place. But then when you're getting older, you're kind of thinking about, okay, like we're actually going to set down roots, we're probably, you know, going to buy a house, that kind of thing. So it started to become much more real. But again, there was like, you know, I had my civil law degree, so I could have done the bar here. I already had done the Ontario bar, but it was really kind of just this moment for both he and I, where the struggles of being geographically so far from our families, because particularly one of my nieces had some medical issues as well, and I just felt this frantic kind of like I can't be there. So that really led to that decision making. And I mean, in hindsight now, I always tell people it was the best decision that we could have made for each of our individual careers. But certainly that was, you know, the challenge of, you know, again, coming back to Alberta and being like, okay, well, I don't really know anybody.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine, like, you've spent all of this time planning for this outcome, and now you've had to completely change course. And it touches on something that I imagine as a female practitioner. I mean, my mom was considering med school too, but she was very realistic about, like, I want to have not one, not two, but three, a bunch of children, as many as I can. And this is just not going to be conducive with me being a doctor. Like,
and I remembered that because I was in Calgary last week, and then I had another vivid memory. It's funny, I think, like, you just forget things because you're like, that was all trauma. But I had an interview in a larger firm there in the Great Search, right, of like, who am I, what am I doing? And, you know, laughed at myself at how strange that would have happened as an outcome, and obviously. But I remember they had asked me, because at that point I was already married, because I had done an undergraduate and a master's, so I was a little bit older than most other people, and they can't ask you how old you are or what you're planning to do with your future, but they asked me if I was married, and I said yes. And then they asked me like a couple of other questions that were kind of after I left. I was like, oh, they're trying to figure out my fertility time. And from a business perspective, I do understand that. But the difference between hiring me and hiring someone else, either who was a female younger than me or not a female, you know, that was actually, and because of discriminate, like they couldn't ask me directly, like, are you planning on having children? And, you know, how many, to your mom's point. But it was very much, I was just like, oh, right? Like I was like, they're trying to nail down, like, is she close to TikTok and she's going to leave us for a year or two, and that will have a financial impact on that, right? But certainly that part of the legal career is a challenge for women, which is very much like, okay, like, because this job also has to build on itself, like you have to build your experience. And so if you take that year, often my colleagues were not, they were taking less than a year. Not that you feel like that was a prejudice to you, but you were not advancing in your knowledge, your experience, and, you know, your career in the same way as your colleagues who were not having children. They're just trying to figure out if I'm, like, you know, close to expiration or whatever.
It's a lovely way of putting that.
I know, but I mean, it was practically speaking, right?
Yeah.
Like if I was, you know, it's much different for them to look at someone who's 25 than someone who's 30, right?
Yeah.
So
I am curious, knowing that you found your way back to Edmonton and found your way into family law. Did you take any family law classes in law school at
There
all?
was one mandatory one. Yeah,
okay.
A mandatory one. And so
what is it like?
Again, well, this one was in the civil side, so it was codified. So a lot of that was, less of the common law like provisions and more kind of, okay, this is like practical guidance. But in the faculties, from what I understand, most who are teaching in family law are currently practitioners, and so ours was. She had been practicing in family law, but the narrative was basically, this is terrible, horrible, no good. How do we battle this out? This is how you go. This is how you claim rights. This is how you force the other one into submission. And so that's why, I had very little interest, and that's what wounds my heart right now, is that I know that there are a lot of students out there who could make an incredible impact in the area of family law, but the common narrative still in the educational institutions is that family law is adversarial, it is conflict driven, it is an impossible equation, you need to battle it out. And also, unfortunately, a lot of family law, the viewpoint is that it's a struggle to kind of build your practice and those types of things. And our experience is actually showing so much different of the potential of what practicing family law could and would be, which is having a peaceful practice and working with people who want to maximize mutual benefit, right? Who really want to kind of lovingly go through this process together. But that traditional realm was okay, this is how you get in the battlefield, and this is how you get your client what they want. And that just didn't seem, I was like, that I'm gonna, like I said, public environmental law sounds like a really safe place for me to be.
Tied to a tree.
Well, I mean, I think it was just again, it was, I was just where do you find that middle layer, right? But just more so, I think what I realized is I just had a broad policy lens, and that's, human rights and those types of things, where I was the world we should be working at making it better. But
yeah, I mean, I think we can collectively agree that family law has bad PR, and it needs to be rehabbed a little bit. Recruitment levels are low, but
I know. Yeah.
I think, and again, I could be wrong about this stat. I mean, I'm often wrong about stats, but it's still 40% of law is family law. It's that kind of imbalance between who is practicing, what is available, access to justice, and its presence in the legal system is, we need to close that gap.
Yeah, and some of the reflections that we had this weekend were a lot of the fact that people end up taking on family files de facto because there's so much availability of it, but they are not specialists, or they don't focus their practice because they're I'll take these family files to pay the bills, but I actually want to be a criminal defense lawyer, or I actually want to do contracts. And so that is the tensions, and particularly that was the conversation this week, is those are ones also who tend to take on legal aid files, which are the most challenging ones, right? But they're trying to build their practice, and so this is at least, it's paid a fraction of what your hourly rate normally would be, but you're building your practice. But because you're building your practice, you are applying your inexperience to what are really acute cases, right? Those are the ones with family violence, those are the ones with these horror stories. And so as a young professional, you start to go in that and you're no thanks, right? This is horrible, I can't handle
That's a really interesting route and highlight, I think, that would never have occurred to me, that yes, as you're starting to get your feet into this industry, you're starting in the hottest water. You got to do the
and
frog
with the highest
thing.
But with the highest stakes, right?
Exactly.
And so,
you need to do it where the water slowly heats up before you realize you're on fire.
Well, that's the thing, that I think they've brought that up, actually. It's being the frog in the water and not realizing.
Exactly. Not realize you're boiling.
Yeah, somebody actually said that. And that's, and particularly because of the importance of family law and the impacts that it has socially, that is an actual problem, right? That, because if that goes sideways, because obviously a lot of these times, if you've got a history of family violence involved, then there's criminal aspects, it just, so the preference would be to have experienced family-focused counsel who, but at the same time, if you're out there, like I said, doing some real estate, writing a couple wills, you're going to be a generalist. And, I don't think that is all that great for Canadians in family law.
Yeah, I feel like at this point we're kind of dancing into our next big conversation would be, which would be burnout. But because that's going to be a big one, I thought maybe we could leave it here for the day. Now that we've gotten your law school retrospective, is there anything else that you would want to say about law school, just in case anyone happens to be listening who is contemplating law school?
You know, like as much as I've said, I think as much as I've said, it's hugely challenging. It does feel like you are in a marathon, and then you're always just kind of like, here's another hill to climb, here's another hill to climb. But at the end of the day, the experience, first and foremost, of getting to experience this, like, I think I'm not probably alone, that some of these people are my soulmates, and we don't see each other very often anymore because we are geographically, but we have that bond, and that's very special because it's almost like going to high school. The first year we had classes with everyone, so if you didn't like certain people, like, you just had to deal with it, right? But so that part, and then learning how to think and thinking critically and thinking logically, and again, like, that I think is a really important part of law school. So, you know, you're going to sweat, there's going to be some sleepless nights, but I think particularly if there are students out there who are, you know, wanting to have more unconventional careers in law, just feel encouraged that it is entirely possible to create your practice, but it just might take a little bit of time, and it might not be as obvious as what the big firms are kind of selling to you as like the only alternative to law. There's so many practitioners out there doing incredible work.
So you don't have to be tied to a tree.
No. Maybe one day. We never know.
Maybe one day. Let's not rule it out.
Yeah, we never know where this journey of mine's going to go.
All right. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Cody.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Separate Together.
If you like what you hear or think someone else might, please rate and review us and tell your friends to tune in. You can find us at onefamily.law.